folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 121. Thank you guys very much for taking the time to download and take a listen again. And this week's show, I want to take just a quick moment and thank a couple of people. In fact, those couple of people are first, the Patreon supporters. I've been talking about them, and a couple more have jumped on board in the last few weeks. My sincerest thanks. If you are interested in supporting the Podcast Digest directly, there's a link in the show notes, folks, to do just that on Patreon. And also, of course, I got to thank this week's show sponsor. You guys know this by now, my very good friends over at Podbean. This week's show is brought to you by them. They offer podcast hosting and monetization. It's the easiest way to start a podcast. If you go to podbean.com/TPD, you'll learn a whole bunch more. And if you're listening before the end of 2016, they are currently offering 30% off their annual hosting plans. If you're listening after the first of the year, that URL will get you your first month free. So check them out. I'll tell you more about Podbean in just a bit. But on to this week's show. I said episode 121. I have made this statement to many, many people in the past over time. You probably, longtime listeners, have heard me talk about it. I myself am an independent podcaster, and I am a huge fan of independent podcasts in wherever I can, and I'll be the first to admit it's probably not enough. I love to shine a light, the little light that I carry in this podcasting space, on an independent podcaster that I think is doing phenomenal work, and that's exactly what we're doing here with episode 121. You guys have already seen it now in the show title. My guest this week is the one and only Paula Allen from the Tell Me Stories podcast. Now, I asked Paula on this show for the second time. Really super fans of the Podcast Digest know that Paula appeared for a brief 5-minute chat in my episode 100, but I asked her on for a very explicit reason, and that reason is that, as you guys know, this show, the Podcast Digest, I am all based majorly on interviews, right? And I am fascinated about other interview-based shows. I've talked a lot about, especially on social media, some of the other interview-based shows that I've listened to and love. Mark Maron, of course, with WTF. Brian Koppelman, former guest with The Moment, now with Slate, are two of my favorite interviews. There's an independent podcaster that fits that bill as well, and that's Paula. Paula's interviewing style and the conversations that she has on Tell Me Stories must be listened to, and I hope you folks will do that after hearing this conversation. So, for the second time, and the first real time, welcome back to the Podcast Digest, Paula Allen.
Thanks, Dan. I'm so happy to be here.
It's great to have you. It's great to talk to you for a lengthy conversation as opposed to our brief encounter in Chicago.
It was brief. Meaningful, but brief. Interview-wise. We still hung out otherwise.
And it's great to talk to you about your show because I've been listening for a good long while and really enjoyed it and have only become more and more intrigued by what you do with it, especially, as I mentioned, with your style of interviewing. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But as I am love to do, for folks that are hearing Paula Allen for the first time and about your podcast, I'd like folks to get to know you a little bit, Paula. So tell folks a little bit about yourself long before Tell Me Stories got started.
So before Tell Me Stories got started, I was just a plebe in the wind. I really have always been collecting stories and writing stories. And I've been a music geek, I think, since probably in utero, I'm going to say, because my mom is a music geek and my older sisters are as well. So I, pretty music obsessed, I'll say. I was not a self-confessed music geek until more recently when it was pointed out beyond any possible argument that, in fact, I am. And I have found some of the best stories that I've heard along the way have been from musicians. And that's for two reasons. One, I have largely been surrounded by musicians. I am a musician, not in any professional capacity, nor will I ever be. As much as I would love to be, I don't have that talent. And that's been pointed out on more than one occasion. And two, because I seek them out. So I've worked in the music industry and around the music industry and over and under and all through, and finally came to the realization that what I was doing was podcastable. So it's something I've done for quite a long time, and there were some reasons why I started doing it, and then I started recording the stories that these musicians would tell after they came off stage. And I knew pretty early on I had something unique and something special that I don't think I've heard anywhere else, which is not to say I've heard it all, but I really think what they bring is incredible, and I'm so privileged and humbled to get to sit down with some of the greatest musicians, and in particular indie bands, because I'm an indie podcaster, so we already have that common ground, and to ask them a little bit about their story.
So, couple of questions I've been thinking about for a while since I heard about your show, the premise of it, and being a subscriber for many months now.
Thanks,
First
Dan.
of all, is why a podcast, Paula? Right? I mean, there are a lot of people in and around the music industry. There are reporters. There's maybe documentarians. There's all kinds of different folks kind of giving that music perspective. But what about the podcast medium made you think that's where I'll go with relaying these stories?
I think because music for me is so personal, and there's something very, even physiologically related to hearing a story sight unseen. When you see video and someone's telling you a story, it's so different from reading a book, and it's so different from the audio, just as reading a book is different from those two things as well. For me, the magic really comes in hearing someone's voice telling their story, and not their life story and not their only story, because I don't think anyone has just one, but a story from their perspective that happened to them in their own voice is such an incredible composition that I don't think can be created any other way. I had early on considered taping these. We did GoPro this summer for one of the bigger festivals, just because we thought it would be kind of a kick, and it was. But I haven't put those up yet because our YouTube channel isn't live, and I don't know. I think it will be interesting for a very different fan base, but for the type of fan base that I created this podcast for, I don't think they're going to go for the YouTube stuff as much. I think it is about that personalized notion of having their voice in your ears, in the same way that when I do a first listen of an album or an EP, I always want my headphones in and I need time alone to do it. And I feel like that's how I make the connection. That's how I write the story in my head. That's how I put it together as something beautiful or interesting in my brain is through audio. I think it creates something so much more special because you're not being fed as much. You're having to draw from your own life to create that picture in your head. And I think audio does that in a way so beautiful. It could never be accomplished with video. And it's, in a way, I always have theorized, technology as this like continual step program where, like eventually we'll move on to holograms, and then like we're all just going to be in each other's faces all the time, and like smellograms, God forbid.
No.
But I do think the podcast is a very specific callback to the notion of storytelling at its essence. And that to me is the stuff of life. I believe so strongly that storytelling is what connects us to each other, and it's how I've understood and felt connectivity in my life. And the passion that I have for music married with that possibility, which can only be done through podcasting, was just kind of this perfect little storm for me. So that's why I did podcasting.
What's super interesting here, Paula, and for folks who haven't kind of pieced it all together yet, Paula's going out and talking to bands, some independent, some more broadly known, and asking them to tell her their stories. And what's interesting is that, and what I think is so intriguing about your show is that these are not your PR release narratives that a particular band may necessarily typically be pushing, right? You're not I mean, it's not that you've never covered these topics per se, but these don't seem to necessarily be the top ones, right? About the new album coming out, and here's the date, and here's the tour schedule, and so on and so forth. It's often very in a very different direction. So what I'm curious about is the idea of pulling out a story from a musician who is commonly more talking to press, quote unquote, scare quotes, press, about a different narrative. How did you decide to kind of put these two things together? What was the concept behind using that? Because I think that's in its essence of its most uniqueness, if that makes any sense.
Dan, you're a great interviewer. Yes. I saw very clearly a gap in what I wanted to know about musicians and how I wanted to connect with them and sort of the mainstream media coverage. If I want to know where a band, I already know where the band is going to be because I'm a music geek. I always know what's happening. Well, for the most part, there's going to be a day where that'll be wrong, and that's all right. I feel like they all have, websites for that. I could just go and seek that information on my smartphone at any time, anywhere. I don't feel like that connects me any deeper with their art, and I don't think that connects me any deeper with their humanhood. And that to me is what I get through music. I feel like their music gives me a sense of that, and I only ever want more because I'm a greedy little person, I guess. So when I interview them, it's because it's not that I won't promote. I mean, and I do, and I go out of my way, when asked, and I deal with PR people a lot. And now that we're going to radio, I deal with them a hell of a lot more. And I respect their place and I respect what they're doing. But I just never cared to know any of that stuff because I could go and get that information anywhere. I don't need someone feeding me that in a pat response because I've seen these interviews take place in person hundreds of times. I did the media scrum at different music festivals, not as an interviewer, just as a handler. Like, hey, go and sit here. Hey, we'll probably feed you at some point. Hey, we need you on stage. Get rolling. That type of thing gave me kind of a good sense, I think, of what was being asked of musicians. And I think what was being asked of them was lazy and was not what the music geek in me ever cared to know because I never stuck around. I always stuck around backstage when those media people, and that's not to put them down, they have, a very important place and I respect them greatly. It's just not what I wanted to do with them and not what I was interested in. I just wanted to fill the gap of more creativity, of kind of catching them at that beautiful moment where they told their best stories on stage through music. And now they've kind of exercised those, not demons necessarily sometimes, but not always. And now they have this sort of beautiful little creative sweet spot where they just want to tell the next story. And I can't tell you the number of times I've heard those stories in person that years later become a song. And that's not true for all of them, but when it is, it's a little bit awesome.
It seems like to me it's so funny because when I first heard your show and first started listening, I couldn't get over sort of my last two questions, which is like, this is so unique. How did you come up with this? And how does the idea of pulling unique, interesting stories from musicians come together? But as I've thought about it more and I've listened longer, and tell me if I'm crazy here, but this is sort of, you just said it, the concept that arguably most musicians, most of the time, are doing exactly this, right? They're telling stories through their songs or their albums. And this is just a natural extension of that same, just in a different format of storytelling.
Yes. I really do think that's what it is. And of the, I've done over 100 now. It's been true every time, which is, indicative of the gap that I was feeling was real. And getting to address that is like winning the lottery, like that they're willing to do it. And everyone has been willing to do it, which is still astounding. And it's like one of those beautiful mysteries where you almost don't want to ask, why are they so willing? except that they are. And so I just choose to love it and try not to question it too much because it might kill the magic. I don't know.
Well, let's go back in time a little bit, Paula. So you get this idea, you're onto this approach for a podcast of pulling these great stories from musicians, right? Mm-hmm. How do you begin this thing, right? How do you even start to be able to gain access for interviews or begin recording? Like, how did this whole thing begin?
On a wing and a prayer, I'm going to say. No, it was, it really felt like it at the time. I still remember a couple of the interviews that I had booked. I remember being in my studio when I got in the email, which of course I've kept, and one I printed out and framed because I'm such a geek, and was just, I stood up, I knocked my chair back, and like I put my hand over my mouth to stifle the scream of excitement. I couldn't believe what people would say yes to. And I think, that was so much the catalyst for why I kept going and why I kept asking. And it has just been yes and yes and yes and yes. And I did work in the music industry. I'm not gonna, suggest that it's like this, just go and ask. It's not that easy. And booking interviews, as you and I have discussed personally, can take months. One in particular took a year of my life. Not that I dedicated my entire year to that, right. It took a year of like, yes, and then cancel, and then yes, and then a bus late, and then yes, and then like, oh my God, it's the middle of a thunderstorm. Clearly this isn't going to work out. And it's just kind of having the audacity to not give up, but also understanding and respecting the artist, where if it is not the day for them, being okay with that. And knowing that when you're honest about being okay with that, you have a much better shot of booking it again. So I worked on music events and concerts and the like, doing logistics and volunteer management, which is like a real paid job. It sounds like a volunteer gig, and it's not. And it's very, very demanding of one's time. I got to know a lot about sort of the music industry and made a lot of contacts, largely just through friendships and happenstance. Never did I foresee that it would go this way or this well. But in particular, what, like the biggest hurdle for me was booking Riverfest 2015. So I had, approached one of the people who I had worked at another music festival with, and he was now helping run this beautiful, wonderful, extremely unique music festival that's so plugged into indie bands and has been an incredible sort of jumping off point for a lot of them. Was Spencer, who helps run Riverfest, and he's just one of those guys where when you meet him, you're like, oh God, like you get music, like I get music, and it's this unspoken kind of phenomenon when you see a music geek in kind of the same light that I've seen myself. And I wrote and rewrote an email to him an embarrassing amount of times where I was going to ask him if I could come and interview people for a podcast that had not yet aired anywhere, and that had not yet interviewed anyone. Mm-hmm. But I saw what I wanted. So I emailed him, and it's one of those things. I don't know if you've had that moment, Dan, where you're just like, I'm going to hit send and just close my eyes and walk away. Because it's so scary. It's so scary. So I did. And this is someone I know and like, but I had never, it's so scary to ask for a favor of that magnitude. And I did. And he wrote back 10 minutes later and said, absolutely yes. And I'm glad it was email and not phone, because I cried. I was like,
wow.
I had been working on my podcast at that point for 6 months, and I already knew what I wanted to do. I just didn't have a gate. open, and I couldn't get it open. I just couldn't break through. Like, I asked for interviews and I tried to sell the show, but sight unseen and audio unheard, I just couldn't. You know, you could be as charming as you want to be, but unless they have something to go on about you,
right.
they can't give the yes. And luckily, Spencer had known me and liked working with me and knew that I respected artists as humans and not just someone I would step on to get to a next level. And he took a very, very big chance on me, a very big chance. I was not experienced enough to do that. And I took it incredibly seriously. Like, incredibly
so where were the nerves in that first conversation? What was the approach? Like, what was the preparation? When you say you took it incredibly seriously, was there like copious amounts of research leading up to that first conversation? What was it like?
It was 3 months of I did nothing else at all but prep. I learned GarageBand like it was my sister. I got a new laptop. Like, I made financial investment. I made an incredible amount of time investment. I had my family, give me the time to do this and the space to do it. And I'll always be grateful to my husband for being just like, babe, if this is what you want, I will do whatever it takes. And he created a website for me. He helped me with tech issues that I had. Everybody, I called in every favor I ever needed in my life. I'm like, this is it. Like, this is the big one for me. I'm not built for the 9 to 5, and I know that, and I accept that. But it's a ton of work otherwise. So I did that work, and I showed up on site, probably shaking head to toe. And my first interview was with a really, really big act. So I practiced on one of the volunteers. And his name is Sam Huddleston. And he was a friend of, and is a really good friend of one of the other creators of Riverfest, who was kind enough to sit down with me for what was an absolute disaster of an interview. And I aired it anyways because it's the honest truth of how it kind of got started. And then I interviewed Shaky Graves, and it was my favorite interview that year. And I sweat right through it.
I was gonna say, so you gritted teeth, you sweat, you prepped, you made it through the first one. Now the next step is putting it out to the world.
Yeah.
So what was that process like? And then the second part of that question is, what did it feel like when it was out there?
Wow, yeah, those are big ones. I was so concerned with making sure I captured Riverfest enough that Spencer would let me do it again that I recorded over 200 hours of tape.
Wow.
So
that's extraordinary.
But that's with not having my interview questions set because I changed my mind halfway through and I saw what worked and what didn't. I didn't have a test audience, and as much as I prepared and felt like I was ready, not doing that test audience ahead of time meant that every interview, because it was a different band every time and a different type of band every time, everyone was brand new, and some of them were incredible and some of them were terrible, and it took months to edit. And I was just buried alive. I remember coming inside. It was probably October. This was in August of 2015. I came inside in October and was just teary eyed. And I said to my husband, I don't think I can do it, babe. I really feel like I've just bitten off more than I can chew. And, he talked some sense into me and turned me around and gently nudged me back out the door into the studio and said, you have it. It's there. Just, you have to find it and you have to make it sound good. So I did the very best I could. And, in hindsight, I got way too complicated with it. I of course can't change it now, and I don't think I would, but I packed in 5 or 10, interviews per episode and released Riverfest 2015 as 3 mega podcasts.
Right.
They're arduous. there's you could hear a learning curve, and this time next year you're gonna still hear it. It's just me. I'm a team of one, so I released episode 1 on December the 3rd of 2015, and I just turned my computer off and I couldn't look until the new year.
Wow.
At Libsyn. I couldn't do it because it was my baby. Like, I had put so much work and of my life and my heart into it. The thought of it not being loved was really scary. Really scary. It still is scary. That hasn't changed.
So after you put it out there, was there a sense of satisfaction at all, or was it like at that point was publishing a reaffirmment that you could do this, or was it like there's no way I can keep doing this? Where were you on that scale?
Once I hit publish, I was like, oh hell, this is out there now. I'm like, for what it's worth. Like, I tried really hard, and I knew I had done my absolute best. And I think that I still stand very strongly by that. When I go back and listen now, there's not a millisecond I wouldn't change and improve. But, I really feel like once it was out there, I felt like I had gotten there. Once I had my first, few downloads, I couldn't believe it. I wasn't available anywhere. I wasn't on iTunes for 2 more months. I didn't know how people found me. I didn't understand any of it at all. I didn't understand the marketing. I knew nothing of anything. But I knew that I had created something that I loved. And I knew that I had made something that I, as a music geek, would have stumbled upon by some miracle and wanted to keep listening to. And that to me was the mark of, you can do this. Like, this is a real thing. You've made it real. It's in the world. And I do remember I specifically celebrated when I hit 100 downloads because it was a big day.
I want to ask you about post Riverfest 2015 and the next chapter beyond that for Tell Me Stories. But before I do that, I want to take a quick break, if I could. And folks, I want to tell you about those folks bringing you this week's episode. That, of course, is my friends over at Podbean. Podbean is for you if you're either a podcaster looking for a new home for your show, or you're a super fan, like I was when I started this show, thinking about starting your own. Podbean's what you need to know about, and you need to know about podbean.com/TPD, and they'll tell you all about the great features. And let me tell you a little bit about a few of them. They're going to set you up with a website, right? It's very much like a blog. You can customize it with different themes and colors. When you publish an episode, it can share out to all your socials with a quality embeddable player. It's all right there. If you've already got a website, you said, no, I got a website. It's 2016, 2017, I got a website. Well, they can integrate with your own website as well. If your show is already existing, all the RSS and iTunes support you're going to need to import or redirect your show if you're migrating it from another hosting provider. Set you up with an app for either Android or iOS. It's all there. Stats, guys. We all are stat junkies. Paula was just talking about 100 downloads. Stats are a big deal to us podcasters, many of us anyways, and Podbean will provide you all the comprehensive podcast stats that you're looking for. If you want to take your show to the next level and try something even more interesting and more rewarding, they've got integrated monetization tools, right? You can designate episodes as premium content. They have a full-blown advertising platform where advertisers will appear in a list, and you can apply to say, I would like to feature your product on my show, and they'll get back to you and say if that's, something that they're interested in talking more about. All of that is built into the Podbean platform. Also a patron program, right? So that people could support you directly. They will feature your show in an online directory and promote you even on the front of the web page periodically. So Podbean offers a lot to current or potential podcasters, and I encourage you to check them out. I mentioned up front that between now and the end of 2016, if you're listening to this, They are offering a holiday special, 30% off all their annual hosting plans through the end of the year. If you're listening after the first of the year, that's okay. Podbean.com/TPD for the Podcast Digest will get you your first month for free. So check them out if you would like to learn more. And my thanks to Podbean for supporting the Podcast Digest. So, Paula, we're talking about now, after Riverfest 2015, in the first 3 episodes you mentioned that were out there, now you're looking at kind of a slight shift of gears into the next chapter of Tell Me Stories. So what was that like?
It was touch and go. I'd like to say first that I met a bunch of the Podbean reps when we were in Chicago at Podcast Movement in 2016. And the level of personal attention that they give is phenomenal. They're they're very, very interested in podcasters as people. And I have to say, like, their follow-up like they're really, really good. I'm on a couple of different, sites, and I try to get out there as much as I can. And Podbean's been really, really great to me. So I will say, shout out to them as well. And they were lovely. So thanks, guys. Thanks for caring about my little podcast.
Wonderful.
Hey. So I then, so from like August to December, all I did was edit and like not eat or sleep or anything. And then in January,
those things aren't that important, are they?
Whatever. They're just like fillers. In January, Spencer touched base with me and said like, "Oh, I heard what you put out, blah, blah, blah. We think it's great, la-di-da. Do you want to talk about the Winter Festival?" And I said, "There's nothing to talk about. I'm there." And, I hadn't seen the lineup yet. And then I did, and like fell over. I was very, very excited. So I came out to their Winter Festival, which is just gorgeous. Like, oh my God. Like, Riverfest does a winter show, and it's called Ice Jam, and it's just phenomenal. The bands that they get. And the thing with living in Canada is this: if you like music, you have all summer. You're like the grasshopper who's singing. You've got like one to go to one weekend, one to go to the next. In the winter, it is like winter is coming, and buckle down with your LPs, because you are not seeing a live band to save your life unless you live downtown Toronto. We don't all live there. I don't anymore. And I feel like there's a huge, desert. And Riverfest has sought to kind of sprinkle some light into that by they do like 15 or 20 bands at this festival. And it's one day. And I hope they're going to expand it to 2, because mama, they need to. The demand is really high.
Yeah.
So
15 to 20 in one day sounds like a busy day for you.
It's very, very serious. It is. And it's so upsetting for me if I don't get to interview everybody. Like, that's like my secret goal. But I will never, ever halt a conversation suddenly. Even like this past summer when like Walk Off the Earth was like ripping open the door because they wanted to do their little promo in my studio ahead of time. I was like, "Oh, I can't. I'm in the middle of another interview." And I never want to cut an interview short if the artist wants to keep going. That has made it difficult to move this to radio. But I also feel like that's kind of given the respect and attention to these stories that are required. So I went to Ice Jam, man, and I interviewed all the bands, and that including like the opening acts, which for me, like a lot of these are big bands. They're signed. They've been signed for years. They're extremely well known, especially across Canada. And getting to interview, the bands that are kind of on that cusp and the ones that are just approaching understanding what it is to be a band. I get to do it all, and that's why I like festivals. So I went and I interviewed them, and I banked another 15 or 20, and I interviewed differently and better, Dan. much
Amazing.
better.
Second time around, things
the
improved.
second time, I know, which technically is like the 45th time around because I interviewed so many bands the first time. And I did it all wrong, but God love me. I'm trying. And I vastly improved the edit ratio and had those out within a couple of weeks. And now my turnaround time is a few hours. It's just it's just vastly improved and much easier on my life. And getting to make eye contact with my husband and daughter is kind of nice.
It's amazing.
It works out well.
Well, I want to ask you, Paula, the last couple of months of Tell Me Stories, there's some big goings on, and I want to stick a pin in that. We're going to get to that in just a bit. But I kind of want to talk about sort of from these first few episodes that we're describing and talk a little bit about sort of that in-between period right there. Because you did some experimenting, right? We're focusing a lot on sort of the core of Tell Me Stories, and there is more to talk about that core in these recent developments I'm describing. But in the middle, you did all kinds of fun stuff in terms of interviewing and conversation. You talked to comedians, you talked to other podcasters, talked to us, and of course there were still the band interviews and stories in there as well. But talk to me a little bit about sort of these middle sort of 30, 40 episodes or so where you it looked like you were sort of experimenting a bit.
I was. And you know what? I feel like there's no wrong way to get better at interviewing. If there's like a class for this somewhere, I should have taken it, but I didn't. And I'm glad now that I didn't because but you're such a good interviewer. And honestly, I feel like, what I get out of these bands works because I'm not quote unquote interviewing them like a regular media person might. And, I'm really just trying to get to a place of comfort for them to share with me a real story that means something to them. So I practiced on anybody and everybody I could. I reached out to my little podcast community, and honestly, Twitter's been phenomenal for that. Just like I always swore I wouldn't have a Twitter account, and now I just laugh at my former self. I reached out to my little Twitter peeps. And it was a tiny group at that time, but I asked them if they would come on and just do something called Friendly Fridays, because I did need some filler in terms of between band interviews. So in the prep and the lead up to the big winter festival, I had run out of stuff. Like I ran out of content, which not great for a podcast, as you probably know, and never happens to you now, but it happened to me then, and would never happen to me now. Now I'm just like, I can't get them out quick enough, but which I'm very, very thankful for. So I practiced on a whole bunch of other podcasters who were wonderful interviews, and I really made some friends that way and I'm still friends with them. Like it worked out incredibly well. This whole new circle of geeks. I went to Podtoberfest as a result of that. And that was just from someone hearing me on another show and thought I was funny. So they called me, and then I, said like, I'm looking for interviews and that type of thing. Actually, that one hasn't aired yet. I should probably do that. So I started interviewing those, and then I fell like a little bit ass backwards into the comedian interview. That was kind of a stroke of luck and largely a package deal. Like I wanted to do this music festival at this place in Kitchener called Center in the Square, and they book really, really great bands. So I called them up and dealt with their PR person, and she was lovely. Alita, she has moved on since, but she was wonderful to deal with. And she said, yeah, you can come and do that. You do need to get clearance first from all the comedians. And I said, what now? She's like, oh, we have the comedy festival first, so we'd like you to do that before you come and do the music festival.
Like, wow, more. Okay.
And I said, oh, I have no experience interviewing comedians at all. She's like, well, you actually have to get individual sign off from all of them first, because they don't put that on comedian writers. When you book a festival, often they'll put on the contract that they need to do media interviews, and that's not true everywhere. And it's been quite a learning curve for me around that. But with comedians, it does not work that way. So I had to personally approach a whole bunch of very famous comedians, which was real scary. And I did it. So the first person I reached out to that was going to be at this festival, and again, this is like weeks in advance, which is not enough time. You need to be doing this months in advance, but I did not have that type of time. I reached out to a gentleman called Steve Patterson. So he runs a couple of shows on CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is the largest media entity in Canada. And he has a couple of the most successful shows that they run. So I don't know how to equate this to what it would be in the States. But like if you called CNN and said, hey, let me interview your top anchor, that was what I had to do that day. So I I emailed Steve and said, hi, I have no business doing this at all. However, here's what I want to do. And his wife is his manager. She wrote back and she's like, he says no to all of these, but he thought yours was so funny that he said yes. I'm like, oh no. Now I have to do this. So I had to interview all of the comedians. And I say had to, it ended up being one of the best nights of my life. I'm still in contact with JJ Whitehead. He was the next level hilarious. And they told incredible stories, and none of it was part of their act. JJ Whitehead, who sometimes goes by JJ Whitesnake, he's an incredible comedian. If you look him up, you're just gonna laugh until you cry. And he ended up writing part of the story that he told me into a bit that he's now, he took to the Edinburgh Comedy Festival in Scotland, and he's taken it to, he lives in LA, and he's taken that to LA as well now too. And to be kind of a strange part of that is awesome. And I would do another comedy festival at the drop of a hat. It was, totally not something I expected to do or thought I would or had any business at all doing, but it was a package deal, so I did it. And no regrets at all. Like, I feel like I let myself kind of be okay with being a fish out of water. And, I feel like I was funny enough to hold my own until I got there. And I saw their acts. And then I had to interview them after, where I was so humbled by how incredibly funny they are. I did get to interview some of the newer ones ahead of time, which thank God, or else I couldn't have done it. I would have been too scared. And then I got to interview the bigwigs after the fact, when I was just obliterated by the talent level, and got to sit in a room with some of the best comedians in Canada and in North America. A couple of them are American. And wow, it was great.
And I'm looking through in your back catalog, Paula, and I think if I've got this categorized correctly, I believe I'm looking at episodes 13 through 20, all released in March of 2016. So, folks, if you want to go back and listen to some of the stuff that Paula's talking about, of course, link to her show in the show notes as always. Yay! And yeah, just looking at some of your show notes in the descriptions, these were some huge people, right? These were people coming off of appearances on Conan, on various different comedy festivals, and Craig Ferguson, and so on and so forth. And it's like, yeah, I can imagine this must have been a bit. And just to be clear, I want folks to understand this, whether we're talking about bands or comedians, podcasters, different story, but bands and comedians, these are all in-person interviews, yes?
100% of them are in person. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I did one band interview. Actually, I did two. One I couldn't air because the audio was so bad, which I'm still sad about. But I did Pretty Gritty Band. They're from Nashville, and I did that over Skype. And the sound quality is not the best on that one. But the interview is so good. I'm not like, oh my God, I'm so amazing. They are so funny and so engaging. They should do interviews as like every time that they do a live show, they should then do live interviews because they're so good at it. And they're so funny. So yeah, that one, the only one that wasn't in person.
Well, and that says something. And the reason I point that out is because, myself and a lot of others that do what I do got it easy, right? We do this all electronically, digitally, over the internet, and so on and so forth. You are physically going to these people face-to-face in their environments, backstage in most cases, and sort of getting their stories. And I think there's something to be said about that. And one more question for you, Paula, before I want to jump into kind of the newest developments with Tell Me Stories, which is, And I mentioned it right up front, and I mean it in terms of your interview style. It is unique, it is different, and I think it's what sets your interview-based show, if it's even an appropriate label to apply to Tell Me Stories, apart from so many others. Over this course now of sort of a year and 50-plus episodes at this point, how do you think your interview style has sort of evolved for yourself personally and in sort of looking at the end product as well in released episodes?
I feel like for the most part, I've continually improved, which is something I hope to always do. I definitely have a few favorites and have listened to them a couple of times, just to sort of gather a bit more about why I liked it so much. And 9 times out of 10, it's, because I connected with them on a personal level and I could hear myself relax and I could, sort of hear at what point they started to see me as someone they were just talking to instead of the interviewer vis-a-vis the interviewee. Like instead of it being a me and you, it just becomes an us. And as soon as it hits that point of conversation, I feel like that's when I know that I'm there. And I could not have recognized that until I was probably 50 episodes deep. And those are to air episodes. Behind those 50, there's another 100 that haven't made it to air. And that is because I will only put out the best possible. And that's with audio that, like, honestly, I'm backstage a lot. It's impossible to get beautiful audio. It's just not possible for me. And, that's something that I have always had to combat. That's something that I continue to struggle with is when I get thrown back there, I can only do what I can do. And sometimes it gets interrupted. And oftentimes you can hear music in the background, which I think is part of the loveliness of it, to be honest. I think it sounds like a real music interview. Yeah. It's a little more real and a little less pat. And, I feel like my interview style has become probably more relaxed and in almost a strange way more focused. And those two sound like they shouldn't be synonymous, but they are. I get to where I'm trying to go with them a little bit quicker. I have more confidence now. And I feel like, I say a lot and I'm always aware of it. I'm super aware of it. But in a way, I think that has helped with the disarming, and to the point where I'm almost a little bit scared that if I get not going to be a problem. Clearly, I can't even get this sentence out. If I get too professional sounding, they maybe won't be as disarmed as readily. I do think that the in-person part of it for me is essential. And though it is harder, and though the audio is way tougher to deal with, and the planning is almost impossible sometimes, because I have a full-time job and a full-time family, and like everybody's busy. And I've got a couple other podcasts on the go because I just apparently don't like sleep. I feel like I would never want to lose that because, in person, I feel I can convey much more readily and clearly who I am and why I'm there. And it seems to be a lot more, I don't know. It just seems to put them at ease more. And
I was going to say, it's a sense of self-confidence now that those nerves you were describing so detailed after that, Riverfest 2015. Now you're probably heading towards these sort of conversations with, I don't know, standing up a little bit straighter, kind of carrying yourself with a little more like, I got this type approach. Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel like before it was kind of like a fake it till you make it thing. Like I don't think I can, because I asked a couple of them after, just ones that I knew like through other people or that I ran into again. It's like, which is so much fun. And they're always up for another interview, which I think is like, all right, they had a good time. That's a good thing.
Exactly.
But they have never said that they thought I was, nervous or unprofessional, which is great, because I felt those things real deep and somehow managed to pass as off as I sort of know what I'm doing. So that's good. And now I just get to have, the same approach. I think I believe it a bit more, which is nice.
Right.
And less sweaty.
Less sweaty. Most important thing. That's
less sweaty is good.
Well, I've been alluding to it, Paula. You mentioned it very briefly about 30 minutes or so ago, but now I want to dive in a little bit to Tell Me Stories has taken on a whole new life here in recent months. Tell folks what that is, and even better yet, how this all came to be.
Yeah, so it's really taken over. At Riverfest 2016, this past August, I flew home from Ireland and went there, and I built, when I say I mean the lovely team of my husband and I, built a mobile podcast studio and took it on site to interview the bands there, which was much, much better than standing, kind of between a couple of trees interviewing people in the sweating sun, which is what I did the first time around. This time was much better. It was air-conditioned studio. We had a sponsor. We had endless beer to give people, which is always a big hit at a concert, which you could probably imagine, and, comfy seats and whatnot. So that worked out well. One of the people I interviewed happened to work for a radio station. He was also and is also a musician, and he said he already knew about the show and was already a listener. He told me this after the fact, thank God, because the interview would have been much, much different and probably not as good because I would have gotten nervous. And he said that he was interested in having this show aired on their radio station. And I said, how? Huh? And he filled me in that they would syndicate this show. So they would go through my back catalog and start airing every episode I've done as part of their weekly sort of indie music spotlight, and that I could have full ownership of what that would look like and how it would sound. So that was kind of a big day. I didn't realize at the time how big, but when it comes to, how shall I put this? My sister kind of brought me down to earth when I was like, oh, this sounds like kind of a cool thing. And then she was just like, I think you don't get what this is going to do, because my sister Andrea has worked in the music industry, largely with indie bands for 20 years. And she said, radio stations, that are college radio stations are the number one first stop for all people seeking indie music. And I a little bit threw up in my mouth when she said that, because I know already that this station is in a very sizable city and has a very big listening audience, because it's one of the few independent college radio stations in Ontario of this kind. And Ontario is really humblingly large. So I'm now trying to make the show sound good enough to be on there, and changing it. I have to take the word podcast out, which is very strange for me, and something I'm open to. Like the point for me is to get these stories heard. Like that's all I ever wanted, and that's all I was ever interested in was, especially when it's a band that I fall in love with, I just want more people to hear them, because when I love music, just like when I love a story, I think its life is in the sharing. And I think its existence is in the connectivity when those things are shared. So, having the ability to reach an audience that big is terrifying and awesome. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Awesome is right. I think this is one of the coolest things I've ever heard in the podcasting space, primarily because typically what we all hear about, right, when you look at iTunes charts and this and that, what's the gripe everybody always had? Oh, those are radio shows coming into podcasting.
Yeah, right? That was what all the awards were at Podcast Movement. I was like, they already had shows.
But you have flipped the script, right? You're a podcast now making your way into radio,
Oh
which
my God,
I think is
yes, yeah.
awesome. It's like you took the thing a lot of us indies always talk about and completely flipped it on its head and shoved it back the other direction, which I think is awesome. I think is great because it's very uncommon. I mean, I've heard a few other stories, right? There's speaking of podcast movement, a guy I met there in person was the name's escaping me now. He's going to kill me. Neighbors from The Herd, right? He started as a podcast and he got picked up by Nashville Public Radio, right?
Oh.
So it does happen, but it's not that common. And
oh God, that's so much scarier for me to hear. I didn't know. It's like I assume this is happening everywhere.
That you're doing this and to hear sort of how this all started, right? You know, in terms of just being you and the recorder and all the hundreds of hours record, and now to see you get to the point now where things have smoothed over a bit. You've got sort of your workflow down. You've got much more confidence heading into these processes, and now to see a third party say, not only do we see that too, but we want to be able to kind of put this on our platform and share it further is just a phenomenal story. And my hat's off to you and what you've been able to accomplish with this. And I think it's a phenomenal story and not one often told in the indie podcasting space.
Oh my God. Thanks, man. I'm really excited and nervous and excited, but scared. But excited. So, thank you.
Has it started airing at the time of the recording? Has it started airing on the radio yet?
At the time of recording, no. And I feel like that's it's going to be coming out in January 2017, as far as I know. They put out like some. I don't know. Are they called feelers? I don't know any of the lingo. And I feel like they put out like a little bit of information that this was coming. And my downloads really hit like a roof just overnight one night. And I had no idea why. And then someone told me, they're like, oh, I heard like an ad that you're going to be on CFRU. And I said, what? I didn't know. So, and then I heard from a couple other people just around the city that, they had heard about it and they didn't know right away that it was me. They're like, wait, Paula Allen, tell me stories. What? Oh my God. Is that you? I had a couple people type. They're like, is that you? I'm like, that is me. How do you know?
So I've got to ask you this, Paula. I've got to ask you this. Just play a hypothetical future type game with me.
All right.
Something I've been saying a lot in a lot of these interviews and a lot of these conversations that I tell people is that people come for the content, but they stay for the hosts. I believe that because I believe it's oftentimes the personality of the host or the co-host or whatever the setup is for the particular show that keep people coming back and back and back. You could probably think of your own favorite independent podcasts or even more national shows, and that's probably true for most of us. Mm-hmm. So as you start to reach a larger audience, if there starts to become a clamoring for you and what you do and your personality and your conversation style and your interview approach, what have you, what happens hypothetically if this station or another or even beyond starts to want you to do more? Maybe other mediums, you've already dabbled with comedians, so on and so forth. What happens? Have you allowed your mind to kind of run with the concept of there might be more out here?
It's hard to imagine because I've been really like just blown away by what's happened so far and just like really humbled by it. I'm like, wow, people are listening. And then, and people are subscribing and telling their friends. And, I get like fan mail, which is so strange because I'm just like, do you want me to interview you? Like, let's talk about you sending me some fan mail, which I've reached out to do. I just haven't had time to do it yet. I think it would be a little bit of all right. Like, I think what's worked for me so far has, every time something new and different, sometimes strange has occurred with this little animal, I feel like I've just said yes. And sometimes it's really gone my way and other times it's been, a great learning curve. And I've had a lot of those and I love nothing more than learning. Thank God. And I feel like if there's more out there, I'm very pro seeing that through. It would be a dream come true to do this for a living. It's so incredibly rare for indie podcasters, and I wish it was less rare. And I'm so excited for the day that advertisers catch on to the fact that we can narrow down to a much more niche audience than any radio station ever has. And that's coming from a place where I love radio and I'm about to be on the radio. But I know that people who listen to my show, well, the numbers will be smaller than they would if they were just turning a dial and happened upon me. The fact that people had to seek me out, and the fact that people had to download it on their own time and, get an app to listen to it, that's like 3 steps and 3 barriers they overcame to reach the content that I'm desperately trying to give them. And to happen upon that on a radio station is going to open so many more doors for them to hear the music and for me to share it with them. And I think it signals that the niche audience that I can reach through podcasting is such a dedicated, loyal, listening, really actively listening audience that once advertisers catch on to that, it will be so phenomenal to see indie podcasters getting to do this as a living. Because I've met some of the most incredible and unbelievably talented people who are podcasters through podcasting. And I hope that so many of them get to do this because they just want it so bad and they're so talented. I just want that for them. And a little bit would love that for me. It's just, it's tough to imagine.
It's going to be an incredible ride to sit back and watch in terms of Tell Me Stories, the radio, and Paula Allen, because I think you're hitting a lot of things that are definitely going to be true, right? People are going to find these bands that you've been talking to. People are going to find out more about your podcast and maybe even be intrigued to check out others. All that's true. I think my last question, though, is I think there's a third sort of pillar to this as well, and I think people are going to find out about you. And while these other things are going to grow in exposure and opportunity, I think you will too, and that's going to be interesting is because I'm wondering if this might not be one of those times where a couple years from now I'm going to be like, hey, I interviewed Paula Allen once, and people aren't going to believe me and those type of things. Because I think that I started this conversation, Paula, out with my admiration for your interview style, and I think that it's your personality and your conversation style that has carried your show to where it is now, and I believe will carry it to wherever it is going. And I think that's going to be an awesome place. So,
wow.
Folks, if you want to get on this ride, and I would strongly suggest that you do, check the link in the show notes for Tell Me Stories and start working through some of the back catalog. And, you may not be in Canada. All the names may not necessarily ring a bell, but listen for some of the things that we've been talking about. There's a reason I'm talking about Paula's interviewing style and that conversation style. And whether you know her guests or have heard of them or not, you want to hear it for that. So, Paula Allen, can you take a moment, please, and tell people where they can go and do that, find this show and all these great episodes?
I will. Thank you. Those are such nice things to say. I'm like, I hope I can live up to that. Thank you. And God, that would be amazing. Yeah, I'm on tellmestoriespodcast.com is my website. And tellmestoriespodcast.libsyn.com is my direct download. And you can find me on Podbean, but of course, and Google Play, iTunes, any place you can find a podcast, look me up, friend. You do need to put in the whole thing because there's other Tell Me Story sounding podcasts out there, but there's only one with Paula Allen, so look me up. And I'm on Twitter at stories_podcast, which is the best way to reach me. And I reply to everybody. I'm on there. I'm active. It's a real thing for me. So I hope that anyone who has enjoyed this episode or is interested in getting to know me better will go and do that. I'm real indie, so you can find me anywhere.
and it's worth doing, folks. Paula's great on Twitter. Paula's got a great show, seriously. And I hope if a couple more people hop on over and check it out, I hope this will have been worth the conversation, Paula.
Oh, Dan, I can't thank you enough. You're just lovely. And you're such a great interviewer. Like, really, it's been, part of my learning has been listening to your show. And, I just want to take a moment to thank you for that. And for not just like, I wasn't blessed with the Dan Lizette voice. I've just got what I've got, man. And, and maybe it would be scary if I did sound like you, but, and I'm totally going to do an impression of you at a later date and send it to you via MP3. But in the meantime, thank you for supporting indie podcasters and, for the amount of names and gets that you get on your show. I'm, unbelievably humbled to be included, and I can't thank you enough. But and thanks for being a friend.
Well, I'm honored to include you, and I'm glad we were able to put this conversation together because I really want people to know more about what it is that you're doing there. So, folks, I want to thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this week's show, please tell a friend, share it on the socials that we've been talking about, and I want to also say that if you really love the show, check out the link for Patreon in the show notes. That would be great to have a few more people hop on that, and I also want to take a quick moment and thank this week's show sponsor. That is Podbean, and thank you to Paula for her kind words about our friends over at Podbean. If you're interested in learning more, podbean.com/TPD. If you're thinking about starting a show or looking for a new home for your show, you'll get the first month free if you sign up with that special URL after 1/1/17. If you're hearing this before the end of the year, 30% off their annual hosting plans if you sign up now. So my thanks to Podbean as well. Folks, that'll do it for episode 121. Next week is my Christmas Spectacular. If you're hearing this the week of the release, I've got a very special guest for you, and I hope you will tell a friend and bring them back with you to check that episode out. Until next week, for the Podcast Digest, my name is Dan.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.